Welcome back. Picture a September morning in the year 1901, on a stretch of dusty shoreline where the Caspian Sea meets the edge of Asia. The air already smells faintly of sulfur and crude oil before the sun has fully cleared the horizon. Out past the old stone walls of a fortress town, hundreds of wooden derricks rise like a leafless forest, their timber frames blackened with grease, steam hissing from engines that never seem to stop. A boy runs barefoot along a rope-strung catwalk between two rigs, carrying tea to men who have been drilling through the night. Somewhere behind him, inside the walled old town, merchants are unlocking their shopfronts beneath a 500-year-old minaret, and a caravan of camels loaded with dried fruit and carpets is being unloaded in a courtyard that has served travelers since before Europe had printing presses. None of them yet know that within a generation, this city will produce more oil than the rest of the planet combined, that fortunes larger than most royal treasuries will rise here in a single decade, and that all of it will then be seized, silenced, and buried under 70 years of Soviet gray before rising again as one of the strangest skylines on Earth. Using artificial recreations built from archival photographs, oil-era paintings, and careful architectural reconstruction, we are going to walk through Baku as it was in each of these lives it has led. The ancient trading post, the walled medieval capital, the roaring oil boomtown, the ashes it was reduced to, and the glass and flame skyline it wears today. And by the end, you will see exactly how each of these same streets, palaces, and shorelines look if you were to stand there this afternoon. Long before anyone thought to drill for oil, Baku was already unusual because the ground here did something no other ground did. It burned. Natural gas seeped up through cracks in the rock and lit itself on contact with a spark, producing flames that danced out of bare earth with no visible fuel, flickering blue and orange over the dry scrubland of the Absheron Peninsula at night like something out of a dream. To the Zoroastrian communities who settled here more than 1,000 years ago, this was not a curiosity, it was proof of the sacred, and pilgrims traveled great distances, some from as far away as India, to pray before these eternal fires. The very name Azerbaijan is widely believed by scholars to derive from an old Persian phrase meaning land of fire, and Baku itself grew up as a modest fishing and trading settlement on the western shore of the Caspian. Its economy built on salt, dried fish, and the caravans that passed along a northern branch of the Silk Road connecting Persia to the steppes. Winters on this peninsula were harsh, cut by a relentless northerly wind so fierce and constant that locals gave it its own name, and the low stone houses of the earliest settlement were built deliberately squat and close together, walls thick, windows small, streets narrow and winding, less a plan than a communal huddle against the weather. In these early centuries, Baku was small, exposed, and repeatedly fought over, changing hands between Persian, Arab, and local Shirvan rulers, its population living in those low stone houses clustered around wells and a modest harbor, its economy modest enough that a single bad trading season could mean real hunger by winter. The people who fished these waters and traded along these dusty lanes in the 10th and 11th centuries had no way of knowing that the black, foul-smelling seep pooling in nearby hollows, the same substance their ancestors had occasionally skimmed off for lamp oil and medicine, and which some medieval travelers described using for treating skin ailments in livestock, would one day make their descendants' city one of the richest places on the planet, or that the walls being raised around their town for protection would still be standing 800 years later, encircling a UNESCO-listed old city while glass towers rose just beyond them. By the 12th century, Baku had become the seat of the Shirvanshahs, a local Persianate dynasty, and the city entered its first true golden age within stone. The Maiden Tower rose along the shoreline, a cylindrical fortress of honey-colored limestone nearly 30 meters tall and roughly 16.5 meters across at its base, its walls up to 5 meters thick, built in stages across centuries. Its true original purpose still debated by historians. Was it a defensive watchtower, a fire temple observatory, or something else entirely? Nobody can say with total certainty, and that uncertainty is part of what makes it magnetic. After an earthquake devastated the Shirvanshahs' earlier capital at Shirvanshah in 1191, the court relocated permanently to Baku, and the city's defensive double walls were thickened and extended, eventually stretching for well over a kilometer and studded with more than 24 defensive towers. Inside those walls, the Shirvanshahs built a palace complex on the highest point of the peninsula in the 15th century, a graceful cluster of courtyards, a domed mosque, a mausoleum, and a bathhouse, all carved from the same pale local limestone. its portals decorated with intricate stalactite like Makarna's carving that would have taken master stonecutters years to complete by hand. This was never a finished, static monument. Sections were repaired after earthquakes, mosques were rebuilt after fires, and even the palace itself shows visible seams where later Shirvanshahs added rooms their grandfathers never imagined needing. An octagonal mausoleum tucked in one corner, a small mosque with its own slender minaret raised at a slightly different angle to the rest of the courtyard. Evidence of a complex added onto rather than built all at once. Underneath much of the palace complex, later excavation would reveal a network of storage cellars, water cisterns, and passageways cut directly into the rock, some possibly linked to escape routes toward the harbor, a reminder that even a seat of government this elegant was built with the constant expectation of siege. It was a living seat of government, receiving ambassadors, storing tax revenue from Silk Road tolls, and housing a court that patronized poets and scholars even while political rivals plotted just beyond the walls. The scent of the Shirvanshahs' kitchens, saffron rice and grilled lamb, drifting out over courtyards where scribes copied manuscripts by lamplight late into the night. The civic and spiritual heart of old Baku beat inside those same fortified walls, layered with centuries of different rulers who each left their mark rather than erasing what came before. The Juma Mosque, built and rebuilt across nearly 1,000 years on the foundations of what may once have been a Zoroastrian fire temple, anchored daily religious life. Its call to prayer rolling out over rooftops 5 times a day. Public bathhouses or hammams doubled as social and even judicial gathering points, where merchants settled disputes over cups of tea as much as in any formal court. A short ride outside the city walls stood, and still stands, the Ateshka Fire Temple, a pentagonal courtyard temple built by Hindu, Sikh, and Zoroastrian fire-worshipping merchant communities in the 17th and 18th centuries around one of those naturally burning gas vents. Its central altar kept alight for religious devotion long after the surrounding land had passed through Persian, Russian, and eventually Soviet hands. Layer upon layer, you can trace the different powers who governed Baku simply by walking from a Zoroastrian threshold, past a Shirvanshah archway, to an Ottoman-influenced merchant house, to a Russian imperial customs stamp on a 19th-century ledger. Step outside the palace walls and into the ordinary streets of Baku at its oil boom peak, roughly between 1890 and 1905, and the scale of transformation becomes almost dizzying. A town of perhaps 14,000 people in the middle of the 19th century swelled toward 200,000 by the early 20th, drawing Azerbaijani, Russian, Armenian, Persian, Jewish, and Georgian workers, engineers, and merchants into a single dense, chaotic, multilingual city. The smell of crude oil hung permanently in the air near the industrial district workers grimly nicknamed the Black City, where refineries and derricks packed the landscape so densely that fires spreading between wooden rigs were a routine, almost weekly hazard. The sudden pressurized blowouts known as gushers sending crude and sometimes flame shooting skyward with little warning. Laborers, many of them Persian and Azerbaijani migrants living in cramped barracks, worked brutal shifts hauling tools and hand-drilling wells before steam power took over, earning wages that were still better than almost anywhere else in the Russian Empire, which is precisely why they kept coming. Meanwhile, along the newly built seaside boulevard and the wide European-style avenues radiating out from the old walls, a different Baku was rising in parallel. One of ornate stone apartment buildings with carved facades, department stores selling Parisian fashion, and horse-drawn trams that would soon give way to electric ones. Street vendors sold skewered sturgeon and fresh flatbread beside newspaper boys shouting headlines in 3 or 4 languages. Tea houses stayed open past midnight serving black tea in pear-shaped glasses to men arguing over oil prices and politics in the same breath. And the contrast between a barefoot oil worker walking home covered in crude and a merchant's wife stepping out of a French-tailored carriage a few streets away was, quite literally, daily scenery. Rents in the city center climbed so fast that newly arrived laborers were often packed 6 or 8 to a single rented room near the docks. While only a short walk away, newly built apartment blocks advertised imported plumbing and electric lighting as their chief selling points, amenities most of Europe's own capitals had not yet fully adopted. Graffiti and hand-painted shop signs layered Azerbaijani, Russian, Armenian, and Persian script across the same storefronts, and the clang of the new electric tram bell mixed, block by block, with the older, steadier call to prayer drifting out from inside the walled old town. 2 rhythms of the same city running side by side without ever quite synchronizing. If there was one site that captured the civic pride of boomtown Baku, it was the theater and public gathering culture that oil money made possible almost overnight. The city that had been a modest walled port a generation earlier now supported a grand opera and drama theater, elegant public parks along the newly reclaimed seafront boulevard, and eventually what would become the Baku Philharmonic Hall, modeled deliberately on the grandeur of the Monte Carlo casino, a statement that this Caspian oil town intended to be taken seriously as a city of European sophistication. Crowds gathered along the boulevard promenade on summer evenings to hear open-air orchestras, watch early moving pictures in converted halls, and see and be seen in the latest fashions shipped in from Baku's new rail and steamship connections to Europe. Ticket prices at the Opera House were deliberately kept within reach of clerks and shopkeepers as well as oil magnates, a point of civic pride among the city's newly minted elite who wanted Baku known as generous as well as wealthy, and on premiere nights the boulevard would fill with carriages lined up for blocks, their drivers swapping gossip while inside, audiences in evening dress sat beside self-made men who, 20 years earlier, had been drilling wells with their own hands. The harbor itself doubled as a kind of spectacle in its own right, crowded with an ever-growing fleet of steam tankers and sailing ships loading kerosene bound for Batumi and onward to European ports. And on public holidays the boulevard hosted fireworks displays that briefly, and probably unintentionally, echoed the very fire cults the region had been famous for 1,000 years earlier. It was here, in these public spaces, that a city built on grease and gushers tried, quite consciously, to prove it was also a city of culture, and for a few astonishing decades it largely succeeded. Nowhere was the astonishing new wealth more visible than in the private mansions the oil barons built for themselves, and few embody it better than the story of Zainalabdin Tagiev, an Azerbaijani entrepreneur who began as an illiterate bricklayer's apprentice and rose to become one of the richest oil magnates in the Russian Empire. His grand residence in central Baku, with its ornate stone facade, gilded interior halls, and imported European furnishings, later became a city history museum. But in its own time it stood as proof that fortune here was not reserved only for foreign investors like the Swedish Nobel brothers, whose own Villa Petrolia compound, with its manicured gardens and comfortable staff housing built for their engineers along the harsh, oil-soaked shoreline, offered a striking green oasis amid the surrounding derricks. Tagiev used part of his fortune to fund the first secular school for Muslim girls in the Russian Caucasus, an extraordinary act of civic investment for its era, and other newly wealthy Baku families competed to build ever more elaborate townhouses, importing Italian marble and French chandeliers to a city that, within living memory, had been built largely of mud brick. And yet, for all their marble staircases and imported crystal, none of these families, however powerful, would be spared what was coming. Wealth built this fast on a resource this politically explosive was never going to be allowed to simply continue. The turning point arrived in stages, and it began not with the oil itself but with the empire around it. Ethnic and political tensions that had been simmering beneath Baku's cosmopolitan surface erupted into violent unrest during the Russian Revolution of 1905 and again amid the chaos following 1917, as competing Armenian, Azerbaijani, and Bolshevik factions fought for control of a city whose oil output was, by then, strategically irreplaceable. Azerbaijan briefly declared independence in May of 1918, becoming the first secular democratic republic in the Muslim world and even extending voting rights to women before most European nations did, a remarkable and often overlooked chapter that lasted barely 23 months. In April of 1920, Bolshevik forces, backed by the Red Army and eager above all else to secure Baku's oil fields for the fledgling Soviet state, marched into the city and dissolved the republic. What followed was swift and systematic. The oil fields, refineries, and pipelines that had made Tagiev and the Nobels among the wealthiest men in the empire were nationalized within months, private fortunes seized, and many of the merchant elite who did not flee were arrested or worse in the years that followed. 2 decades later, in the summer of 1942, Baku's oil fields became a strategic obsession of an entirely different order, as Nazi Germany's case blue offensive drove deep into the southern Soviet Union with the explicit goal of capturing Baku's wells, believing, correctly, that Soviet resistance could not continue without them. The German advance was ultimately halted well short of the city at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus foothills, but for months Baku lived under the very real shadow of becoming the campaign's ultimate prize. The grand boulevard theaters kept operating, the Philharmonic kept its doors open, but the city that had once built European-style opera houses on oil money now operated inside a rigid Soviet industrial system, its wells still pumping, but its profits and its independence gone. For the better part of the next 50 years, Baku settled into a kind of quiet, functional obscurity within the Soviet system. It remained an important industrial center, its refineries still running, its Caspian offshore platforms pioneering some of the world's first true offshore oil drilling technology in the 1940s. But the flamboyant, cosmopolitan boomtown identity of the 1900s was deliberately submerged beneath gray Soviet apartment blocks, state planning, and an economy that no longer allowed individual oil barons or their gilded mansions to define the city's image. The old walled town survived largely intact, almost by neglect, its narrow lanes and Shirvanshahs palace preserved less out of reverence than because Soviet urban planners simply built their new city around it rather than through it. Many of the great merchant villas were converted into government offices, schools, or museums, their ballroom ceilings still gilded but their function utterly changed. Monuments to a wealth the new order publicly disdained even as it inherited the very wells that had created it. Baku's second rediscovery, and its most dramatic transformation, began not with archaeologists but with a signature. In September of 1994, 3 years after Azerbaijan regained independence following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the newly sovereign government signed a landmark deal with a consortium of international oil companies, an agreement so consequential it became known simply as the contract of the century, reopening Baku's Caspian oil and gas reserves to global investment for the first time in 7 decades. What followed over the next 2 decades was, in effect, a second oil boom, and this time the wealth it generated did not go into gilded 19th-century mansions but into an entirely new kind of skyline. Architects and engineers descended on Baku to build structures that seemed determined to answer the boomtown extravagance of a century earlier with equally audacious modern statements. And what surprised so many visitors and historians alike was not a buried treasure pulled from the earth but a city that had, almost invisibly, preserved its walled medieval heart completely intact underneath all of it, waiting for the world to notice again. It is worth pausing here briefly on what all of this really means. Behind every derrick fire and every gilded staircase in this story were real people going to work, raising children, falling in love, burying their dead, exactly as anyone does. The oil barons and the barefoot drillers, the Zoroastrian pilgrims and the Bolshevik soldiers, all believed they were living in an ordinary present, not a chapter in someone else's documentary. What survives in Baku's stones and streets are not just architectural styles but the accumulated evidence of how differently, and how similarly, people have always tried to build a life for themselves. Walk through Baku today and that entire layered history is visible almost within a single glance. The old walled city, Shirvanshah, still stands largely as it did centuries ago. Its narrow cobbled lanes, the Shirvanshahs Palace, and the Maiden Tower all preserved as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And you can climb the Maiden Tower's interior stairways today exactly as visitors have for generations, looking out over a shoreline that has changed almost beyond recognition around it. The Ateshka fire temple outside the city still burns, though today its flame is fed by piped gas rather than the natural seep that first drew pilgrims there. And it operates as a museum where visitors can see the same courtyard cells once used by traveling Hindu and Sikh ascetics. Villa Petrolia, the Nobel family's old garden compound, has been carefully restored as a museum dedicated to the oil boom era, its manicured grounds once again offering a green retreat amid the city. Tagiev's mansion still stands in the city center, now serving as the Azerbaijan National History Museum, its gilded halls open to the public rather than to invited guests. The seaside boulevard the oil barons built for evening promenades has been extended for kilometers along the Caspian shoreline, still filled each evening with families walking exactly as they did more than a century ago, only now beneath the glow of an entirely different skyline. And rising directly behind that historic waterfront and the old stone walls are the Flame Towers, 3 glass-clad skyscrapers completed in 2012. The tallest reaching 190 meters. Their curved silhouettes deliberately designed to echo the shape of fire, wrapped at night in thousands of LED lights that animate flickering flames across their entire surface, a 21st-century monument to the same natural fire that drew the earliest Zoroastrian pilgrims to this coastline over 1,000 years earlier. The old opera and philharmonic halls that once hosted Boomtown premieres still stage concerts today, their gilded interiors restored, their audiences now just as likely to be tourists as locals. Down at the harbor, where oil tankers once queued to load kerosene, a public park and a row of modern cafes now line the water, And on any given evening you will find families eating ice cream on benches within sight of both a 900-year-old tower and a building shaped like a flame. Even the industrial district workers once called the Black City has been substantially redeveloped, its old refinery land reborn as a business district, though a few preserved chimneys and brick facades remain, deliberately left standing as a quiet nod to what powered the city's first transformation. Stand at the base of the old fortress walls after sunset today, and you can watch centuries of Baku's story compressed into a single sight line. Honey-colored medieval stone in the foreground, and behind it, 3 towers of glass and light, still, in their own strange modern way, worshipping fire. That is Baku for you, a city that has been a Silk Road trading post, a fortified Persianate capital, the oil capital of the entire world, a quiet Soviet industrial town, and now a glittering Caspian skyline, all without ever fully leaving any of those earlier selves behind. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and walking through all of it together. If there's a place, a lost city, or a forgotten chapter of history you'd like to see brought back to life like this, drop it in the comments below. I genuinely do read every suggestion, and if you enjoyed the trip, a like and a subscribe helps this channel keep making them. Until the next city rises out of the dust for us, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon.